The United States has seized an Iranian ship near the Strait of Hormuz, and that is the kind of headline people often misunderstand at first. They hear it as one more dramatic episode in an already chaotic war, one more confrontation, one more provocation, one more clip for the news cycle. But this moment matters for a deeper reason. A ship seizure at Hormuz is never just about one ship. It is about who controls movement, who controls fear, and who gets to decide whether one of the most important arteries in the global system remains a trade route or becomes a battlefield. According to AP and the Washington Post, the vessel was the Iranian-flagged cargo ship Tuska, intercepted after the U.S. said it was trying to bypass the American naval blockade. A U.S. destroyer disabled the ship, Marines boarded it, and Iran immediately condemned the move as piracy and a violation of the fragile truce that is barely held together. That means the real question is not simply whether Washington seized a ship. The real question is whether the Hormuz crisis has crossed into a more dangerous phase, where navigation itself becomes part of the war. That is what makes the title of this video so powerful. Is the Hormuz war exploding again? Because the answer is not about one explosion. It is about a threshold. On paper, the U.S. blockade that began on April 13th was framed by CENTCOM as a blockade of ships entering or leaving Iranian ports, while saying it would not impede freedom of navigation for ships going to non-Iranian ports through Hormuz. But real crises never stay on paper for long. Once you have a blockade, an armed interception, and a live dispute over who is allowed to move where, the legal language starts giving way to military reality. And military reality in a narrow choke point is always harsher than diplomatic language. The seizure of the Tuska marks the first direct use of force in this blockade phase, which means the conflict has now moved beyond warnings, beyond notices to mariners, and beyond symbolic pressure. A destroyer fired, a ship was disabled, Marines took control. That is not background tension anymore. That is the war touching the artery directly. To understand why that matters, you have to stop thinking about Hormuz as a regional side street and start thinking about it as one of the hidden load-bearing beams of the modern world. The International Energy Agency says an average of 20 million barrels per day of crude oil and oil products transited the Strait of Hormuz in 2025, equal to around 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade. It also notes that the strait is only 29 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, with navigable channels just 2 miles wide in each direction. This is not some abstract line on a map. It is one of the tightest and most consequential corridors in the global economy. The IEA also says that about 80% of the oil transiting Hormuz is destined for Asia, while almost 20% of global LNG trade depends on this route as well. So when violence or coercion enters this passage, what is under threat is not merely Gulf shipping. It is the physical continuity of the system that moves energy from producers to industrial societies. Markets can pretend to be sophisticated. Governments can talk about resilience. But when one narrow corridor carries that much strategic weight, everything still comes back to geography. This is why a ship seizure can matter more than 100 speeches. It turns the conflict from a story about intentions into a story about mechanisms. And mechanisms are what define the next phase of a war. CENTCOM said on April 11th that U.S. forces had already begun mine clearance operations in the Strait of Hormuz, with destroyers transiting the area and preparations underway to establish a new safe passage for commercial traffic. That detail is easy to miss, but it matters enormously, because once a navy is not just warning but actively trying to clear, secure, and define the route, the line between protecting commerce and enforcing military order becomes very thin. And once the U.S. is disabling ships while also shaping safe passage, the entire maritime space begins to feel less like international transit and more like managed confrontation. At that point, every vessel becomes a test of authority. Every captain becomes a potential flashpoint. Every radio exchange becomes a moment where a local incident can suddenly become strategic. That is how wars expand in the modern world. Not always by giant new offensives, but by turning essential systems into contested systems. What makes this even more dangerous is the word again, because this is not happening in a vacuum. Over the last days, the Strait of Hormuz has already gone through repeated phases of opening, restricted control, and renewed coercion. AP, The Guardian, and The Washington Post have all reported that Iran tightened control over the strait again after a brief reopening, warned ships against transit, and tied movement in the waterway to the wider standoff over the U.S. blockade and unresolved negotiations. That means the system has already lost the illusion of normality. And once normality is gone, even temporary calm becomes deceptive. A one-time closure can be treated as an emergency. A repeated cycle of closure, warning, partial reopening, and armed interception is something else entirely. That starts to look like a new operating condition. It tells traders, insurers, navies, and governments that Hormuz is no longer just a vulnerable point in theory. It is a choke point being actively used, tested, and repriced in real time. And when a choke point begins behaving like that, the danger is no longer only what happens today. The danger is that every actor starts adjusting for tomorrow. The oil market has already been forced to adjust. The IEA said in March that oil flows through Hormuz had fallen to less than 10% of pre-conflict levels, which pushed its member countries into the largest emergency oil stock release in the agency's history, 400 million barrels. That move alone tells you how seriously states view this corridor. The U.S. Energy Information Administration said on April 7th that the closure of Hormuz and related production outages are key drivers of its latest forecast. It said full restoration of flows would take months, that Brent averaged $103 per barrel in March, and that fuel prices would continue rising until the variables around closure duration, outages, and reopening are resolved. The EIA also estimated that major Gulf producers collectively shut in 7.5 million barrels per day in March, with outages expected to rise in April. Those are not normal wartime tremors. Those are structural stress signals. They tell you that the conflict has already moved out of the realm of military theater and into the hard plumbing of the global economy. Once that happens, the conflict stops being confined to the Gulf. It begins transmitting itself into inflation, transport costs, industrial margins, and political pressure far from the battlefield. And this is where the meaning of a bigger war changes. Most viewers imagine a bigger war as a cinematic event, more missiles, more countries entering openly, more fire on the screen. But bigger wars often begin in colder, uglier forms. They begin when commercial systems stop feeling commercial. They begin when ship owners start asking whether a route is still viable. They begin when insurers harden terms, when cargoes reroute, when naval escorts become normal, and when a passageway used by millions of barrels a day starts operating under armed suspicion instead of routine confidence. The Tuska seizure matters because it shows the conflict is now moving through that colder layer. The war is no longer only what explodes on land. It is also what hesitates at sea. It is what gets delayed, searched, diverted, disabled, or boarded. The violence does not have to become more spectacular for the strategic consequences to become more severe. In fact, sometimes the most dangerous phase is the one that looks almost procedural. Warnings issued, courses challenged, engines disabled, cargoes inspected, flags identified, patrols extended. That is the phase where everyone tells themselves the situation is still manageable, right before it stops being manageable at all. There is also a credibility battle hiding underneath all of this. For Iran, maintaining pressure around Hormuz reinforces the message that sanctions, blockade, and coercion will not go unanswered. For the United States, enforcing a blockade and seizing a vessel signals that Washington is willing to turn maritime power into direct leverage, not just indirect threat. That makes the strait more than a shipping route. It becomes a stage where both sides are testing the outer limits of credibility. And credibility contests are extremely dangerous in narrow corridors because backing down looks costly while overreacting feels tempting. AP and the Washington Post both indicate that this seizure came just as renewed talks were supposed to be organized in Pakistan, with the ceasefire window already under strain. That is exactly the sort of timing that makes diplomacy weaker, not stronger. When force is used immediately before fragile negotiations, the meaning of every next move becomes more uncertain. One side says it is enforcing the rules. The other says it is proving the rules are a sham. The result is that diplomacy must now operate in the shadow of a live maritime escalation, and that is one of the hardest environments in which to preserve calm. The deeper problem is that the world economy is not built on abundance as much as it is built on uninterrupted movement. The IEA says only 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day of pipeline capacity is realistically available to bypass Hormuz, against roughly 20 million barrels per day that normally transit the strait. That gap is the story. It means the system does not have a clean substitute for this corridor. It has partial workarounds, not true replacement. The IEA also notes that almost all of Qatar's and the UAE's LNG exports pass through Hormuz, representing about 19% of global LNG trade. So when people say, surely the world has alternatives, the answer is not enough, not quickly, and not without pain. And once you understand that, you understand why military incidents in this waterway are so dangerous. A local confrontation does not stay local when it touches a route that underpins oil flows, gas flows, spare production capacity, and the confident structure of maritime trade. That is why a ship seizure here feels different from a ship seizure somewhere else. In Hormuz, even a narrowly tactical action can echo like a global stress test. So, is the Hormuz war exploding again? The most honest answer is this. It may not be exploding in the loudest sense yet, but it is absolutely intensifying in the most structurally dangerous sense. The seizure of an Iranian vessel by U.S. forces is not just another headline layered on top of chaos. It is a sign that the conflict is moving deeper into the machinery that sustains commerce and power. The battlefield is spreading into the corridor. The corridor is spreading into the markets. The markets are spreading the pressure into the wider world. And that is how regional wars stop being merely regional. They become systemic. They become harder to contain, not because everyone wants a wider war, but because too many essential functions are now entangled in the same narrow space. When that happens, even actors trying to avoid catastrophe can find themselves producing it. A warning shot lands badly. A naval escort meets resistance. A ship ignores instructions. A mine clearance mission is challenged. A second seizure follows the first, and suddenly the war is not returning to Hormuz. It is living there. That is why viewers should not ask only whether the next missile is coming. The more important question is whether the system around Hormuz can still function without humiliation, miscalculation, or force becoming the default language. Once a state seizes another state's vessel in a corridor this important, the burden of proof shifts. The burden is no longer on analysts to explain why the choke point matters. The choke point has already explained itself. It has reminded the world that geography still rules beneath finance, beneath diplomacy, beneath technology, and beneath all the comforting language of modern interdependence. The United States has now shown it is willing to enforce pressure in the maritime domain directly. Iran has shown it is willing to keep Hormuz inside the confrontation rather than outside it. The energy market has shown it still cannot shrug this off, and history usually gives a cold answer when all of those signals line up at once. The danger has not passed. It has changed form. So no, this is not just a ship seizure. This is what it looks like when a strategic artery starts behaving like the front line. And once that happens, the biggest risk is not the headline you just saw, it is the next one that follows from it.